Oh my god, this is so overwhelming. There's so many different types of wine here. How do I know which one is good? I just want to get a good bottle. Oh god. I wish there was just some way for me to know which wines were good or not. Like some sort of numerical system to tell me which wine I should buy.
Surprise, motherfucker!
Bing, bop, boom, 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 bop, bam. The type I'm on you wouldn't understand.
Look at all these goddamn wine scores. What does it all mean? It would be hard today to walk into a decent wine shop and not see scores plastered everywhere. You got stickers all over bottles, you have shelf talkers, and you have sections of entire stores devoted to 90+ point wines. And it seems like a lot of these scores are kind of sus. But it wasn't always this way. Since the 1980s, the wine critic industry has undergone a giant boom, and in today's age, it is kind of hard to tell for the average consumer whether or not a score is legit or not. And I ask, who shall critique the critics? This fucking guy. And who am I to judge this? I am just a wine nerd. I'm someone who has years of experience working as a sommelier in fine dining. I've worked as an importer and also many years on the ground working in wine shops, interacting with customers and reps and wineries and all that jazz.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
I have a relatively comprehensive view of just how relevant and pervasive the wine scoring industry has become and how much weight consumers put on these scores, as well as just the general feeling of disdain that the whole wine industry feels towards them. But enough chit chat, let's dive into it. And there's only one man that we could possibly start with, and that is Robert motherfucking Parker, aka Mr. Full Body, aka the King Boomer himself, aka a guy that you're definitely not afraid to spend a night with in a remote ski chalet during a blizzard. Robert Parker is the undisputed daddy of the modern wine critic. If you're going to talk the industry, you have to talk about Robert Parker. If we just Google wine critic, we see that Robert Parker's Wine Advocate is the first actual wine critic website to show up. And this website is the meat and potatoes of Robert Parker's critic business in the modern era. How it works is they sell subscriptions for full access to the website, providing scores/tasting notes to thousands of wines, and full access to lots of articles detailing all sorts of stuff like producers, regions, vintage reports, etc., all coming from a variety of contributors under the Robert Parker umbrella. And it's pretty much what you expect from a wine critic website. If you don't have a subscription, there is some free content. There's a small section for free access articles, like this one here on a single vineyard Willamette Chardonnay, which reads, unfortunately, a bit more like an ad than wine journalism. There is also a free-to-access vintage guide on the website, which seems relatively robust and pretty accurate with its scores, so probably one of the most useful components to this website. And finally, we've come upon the green emblem section of the website, which is an award that the Wine Advocate gives to quote-unquote sustainable wineries, given out based on some pretty vague criteria about sustainability. Looking through the list of wineries that have received this award, there are definitely some great sustainable wineries in there that definitely practice regenerative agriculture and all that good stuff. But it leaves the question just why? Why do we need another sustainability certification, especially coming from a critic, when there are just so many good and objective sustainability certifications out there? Anyways, enough about the website. Let's talk about the man himself. He was born in Baltimore in 1947, and his journey to wine started in 1967 when he went to visit his future wife in Alsace, France. That was his first foray into the world of wine, and he fell in love. He returned to the States. He He became a lawyer, and while practicing, he started his own little venture, put up his own money to start the Baltimore, Washington Wine Advocate. He created the Wine Advocate with an ethos inspired by Ralph Nader, a political activist. The idea was to create a wine publication that was free of all the conflicts of interest and financial incentive that plagued many other critics of the time, and to fund it entirely by subscribers, which is somewhat revolutionary at the time. So he was still working as a lawyer during this time while he started the publication, but his big break came in 1983 when the 1982 Bordeaux vintage was released, and Robert Parker thought it was a superb vintage, like legendary in his eyes. And that was not the consensus. People thought that the fruit was too opulent, that the style was too ripe, and that it wasn't going to have the longevity of traditional famous Bordeaux vintages. Turns out Robert Parker was right, and 1982 to this day is one of the greatest Bordeaux vintages of all time. And it was in 1984, after people started to see that Robert Parker experienced a giant boom in subscriptions to his publication and was able to leave his job as a lawyer and become a wine critic full-time. Robert Parker accomplished a lot in his career, and there's a lot that I could probably touch on, but what he is most famous for, and I have to talk about, is the 100-point wine rating system. That was his creation. Before then, people were rating wines usually on a 20-point scale, and he felt that sometimes led to score inflation and didn't allow for the nuance and wiggle room that you can get with a 100-point scale. So the 100-point scale, let's break it down. What it is not out of 100, it's really 50 to 100, and it goes like this. We've got 50 to 60 is for flawed, below average wines. These are wines that are unacceptable. These are things that are super fucked up and have lots of flaws going on and are undrinkable. So the worst wine score you could possibly get would be a 50. 60 to 70 is for below average wines. 70 to 80 is for average wines. 80 to 90 is for above average to very good wines. 90 to 95 is for superb wines. 95 to 100 is for excellent, best of the best wine. And something you might be thinking at this point is, isn't this a little problematic, creating a system that's assigning things like grades that can be somewhat objective, you either got a question right or wrong, versus wine, which is entirely subjective? Yes, there are objective components for which you can assess quality in wine, but it is ultimately going to be something heavily influenced by the human condition, which is just the state you're in, the environment you're in, do you have an emotional connection to the wine? And Robert Parker has this to say, which is somewhat in contrast to his development of the system. Scores do not, in fact, reveal important information about a wine, and that it is the writing and companion to the scores that has all the good information in it. Well, then why score the wines if they don't reveal important information? He's also been quoted in saying the only difference between a 95, a 96, a 97, all the way to 100 is the emotion of the moment, which seems kind of counterintuitive. I mean, it's a nice piece of ownership acknowledging that there's lots of subjectivity to it, but you're making bank and a career off of giving these scores. So which one is it?
You want to tell me what the fuck is going on?
This is fucking important context. I really think that quote should be beneath every score on every shelf for every wine in the world, just so people can understand that, hey, this is just someone saying a thing. So let's get into some of the issues / controversies around Robert Parker. And yeah, there's a couple of doozies in here. First, big one, Parkerization. This is a crazy one. Parkerization. So what this is a reference to a movement of global wine-making practices and stylistic preferences towards what is considered an quote-unquote international style. An example of this being more heavily extracted, fruitier, oakier, softer red wines. This movement towards an international style is undoubtedly a thing. There has been a massive movement towards this style. I would say in the current era, we're kind of backtracking from that back towards more distinct terroir-driven expressions of wine. But nonetheless, this phenomena is real. What is up for debate is whether or not this is Robert Parker's fault. The idea is that through his palate and his preferences and just the value of his scores, he drove winemakers and consumers towards these styles and changed the landscape of wine as we know it. This is a highly contentious issue, whether or not Parker truly pushed the world of wine this much, or was it other factors, like perhaps Pénotization. There's Émile Pénot, considered the father of modern enology and winemaking, who pushed a lot of cleanliness practices in vineyards and a bunch of stuff that I'm not going to get into, but he arguably could be responsible for this movement towards an international style, and not Robert Parker. But nonetheless, Parkerization is a term you're going to hear thrown out a lot in the world of wine. And even if we are to take Parkerization as a fact, what about the responsibility we bear as consumers, as sommeliers, as winemakers? Do we have no agency in this world to choose how we want to consume and make wine? Is it really just one man's fault for publicly declaring his preferences in wine? I don't know.
So whose fault is it really?
The second big issue I will discuss is Parker's impact on wine prices and the wine market in general. Robert Parker was the most famous wine critic in the world, and his word carried a lot of weight. People estimated that a perfect 100-point score from Robert Parker on any vintage of a wine is going to multiply the wine's price by about 4x. Now, some of this evidence is a little more anecdotal, but what is not anecdotal is the situation regarding the 2002 En Primeur for Bordeaux. So there's a thing every year called En Primeur, which is the release of the previous year's Bordeaux's, and it's a big deal because Bordeaux is a super famous wine region. And normally Robert Parker would taste barrel samples before the En Primeur, before all the wines are released and people are buying them and prices are set, so that there was a score before wineries were setting a price. Except in 2002, which the En Primeur took place in 2003, Robert Parker released his scores after En Primeur. So there was data available to be analyzed on his effect on Bordeaux. And so now there is this wonderful study using that data that conclusively proved, using math, that Robert Parker's scores greatly influenced the price of Bordeaux. And in the year that he did not rate Bordeaux before the release, things were much cheaper. And in subsequent years and in previous years, when he scored wines highly, it would significantly affect their price.
That son of a bitch!
All right, now let's actually talk about the accuracy of his scores. Can you trust the scores? It's worth noting in 2019 he did retire, so the Wine Advocate scores that you get are going to be by masters of wine that work under him or other people on his editorial staff at Wine Advocate. So, you know, what I'm saying here is going to be more about Robert Parker himself, but that does seem to translate to the new wave of people underneath him. Let's give some example of some Parker scores. Got the 2010 Dominus. Now, this is a wine I've actually had, and this is a point that Parker gave 100 points to, and one I would probably agree with. I'd say this is a pretty fair 100 points. This wine was chef's kiss. For me, this wine transcended just me evaluating the structure and the concentration and all the components of the wine, and just had that je ne sais quoi, god damn, this is good. And I feel that kind of proves his point of it being worth 100 points, because I am not super into Cali Cabs. I'm definitely not someone who chooses to drink fuller bodied reds, especially from California, very often, and this wine blew me away when I got to try it. Now I found this one, the 2012 Viñedos del Yaso Toro, and this is a wine that Robert Parker gave 93 points to that seems like was a major overshoot. That this is not a wine that ever really gets in the 90s, and you could argue that maybe this is a great vintage for it, but a lot of the other critical reviews seem to be way more rooted in the 80s, and that this is like an above average wine, but nothing special. There's nothing super exemplary about it. It doesn't have particularly good concentration. The oak is not in great balance, and that this is a wine you could even argue is average or below average, depending on your palate. And just to give it a 93 feels egregious.
Is he out of his fucking mind?
The 1996 Chateau Margaux. This is one of the most iconic Bordeaux's, and this particular vintage I was lucky enough to try when a guest brought into a restaurant I was working at, and it was incredible. Robert Parker gave it 100 points, and I would probably disagree on this one. This is for sure a 90 plus point wine. It has all the components. It meshes well. It was in a good spot when I tasted it. I don't know what year Robert Parker tasted it and gave it 100 points. So that is a flaw in my logic there. But I will say Jancis gave it an 18, which is, you know, a cut above, like a great wine. And I think that is a fantastic score to give it. I do not think, though, that this has reached, the 96 vintage reached the levels required for calling it a 100-point wine, of having that just transcendent je ne sais quoi, oh my god, this is incredible moment. But, you know, there's also bottle variation and blah, blah, blah. Many reasons why his score could be legitimate and mine not. 2013 Kilkeda Creek Cab. I'm pretty sure it's actually pronounced Kilsida or something like that, and a guest made fun of me once for pronouncing it Calcada, but whatever, we're gonna roll with it. I've had this wine, I've had the 2013. Excellent wine, super rich, deep, complex, concentrated. 100 points? Hell fucking nah. I do not think that this winery, for me, would be one that would ever reach 100 points unless they had an exceptional vintage and perhaps changed a little bit in their winemaking. Yeah, it was delicious, an excellent wine, something maybe more suited for like between 90 and 95. And I think that's kind of the consensus among other critics other than Robert Parker for the 2013. And looking through his scores, you'll see a huge amount of sine qua non that makes 100 points. Huge amount of 100-point sine qua non. And if you don't know about this winery, this is like a super cult winery in California that has super small production, impossible waiting list to even get on, let alone make it through so that you could get an allocation of their wines. But they do Rhone-styled wines in California that are often massive. They are quite often over 15% alcohol and deeply rich and complex, but heavy-handed, some would say. And the fact that Robert Parker has given dozens of 100-point scores to sine qua non, I think is exemplifies that he is particular towards that style, and that's okay. You know, many people think sine qua non is one of the best wineries in the world, and I would probably agree. In some respects they are, but it's a lot of hundreds. Another one is the 2008 Vérité Lamuse. I chose this one because I have also had the 2008 of this wine, and again, this is a super rich, deep, extracted, complex style of red coming from California. It's an iconic cult producer, and for me, this is for sure not 100 points. For me, it was kind of lacking the acidity and the weightlessness that you get from the exceptional reds. When a full-bodied red from California is peak, when it is that je ne sais quoi, oh my god, this is perfect 100-point wine, it's usually because it has kind of like a weightlessness to it. It's beyond the concentration and the flavors and the structure and blah blah blah. It kind of hits the palate in a way where it does not feel as rich and cloying as perhaps it is. And with this 2008 Lamuse, I thought it was excellent, and it for sure had great acidity and structure, but it did not hit that. You could tell you're drinking a super extracted wine. And again, delicious, excellent 95-ish point wine, which many critics would agree, but for me, for sure not 100.
Corruption or incompetence?
I think Robert Parker had a bit of a more of a lowest common denominator palate than many other wine nerds and critics at the time. And that was a great thing for the public. You know, they got their palates and preferences affirmed by having a guy who's super into these bold and rich and smooth styles say, hey, these are the best wines. And it brought him massive success as well. So there was definitely something to learn in Robert Parker's palate and preferences and how that revolutionized the wine world and critic industry. And let's not forget that he was a lawyer at the end of the day. If you've ever worked in the wine industry and served a group of lawyers, what do they like? They like the Amarones, they like the Napa Cabs. Whether that's Robert Parker's fault or just something intrinsic to people who become a lawyer, I don't know, but I'm gonna choose to believe the latter. So in scoring Robert Parker, I'm going to give his integrity a 20. You know, he was the first person to do the subscriber-based model. I'm going to give his accuracy an 18. I think that his scores overall are reasonable. I'm going to give his comprehensiveness 15. He really was more focused on like the famous regions, but also he was one of the earlier critics and kind of brought more light to those regions in the first place before they were super famous the way they are today. So he deserves some credit there. And I'm going to give his vibes a 22 because, you know, he looks a little scary in the photos, but he seems like a pretty chill guy when you listen to him talk. So overall, Robert Parker, you get a score of 75. Your vibes are kind of mid, but I'd still want to party with you.